The BlackHFY had never encountered a species quite like this before. Commander HFY stood on the bridge of the Dominion's edge, watching through the view screen as their salvage crews worked to breach the massive derelict vessel floating in the void. It was ancient, older than their civilization, older than most star systems in this sector. The ship itself defied conventional design, a massive, elongated cylinder nearly 50 kilometers long, spinning slowly on its axis to generate artificial gravity, primitive by BlackHFY standards. Yet somehow it had survived the vacuum of space for millennia. Report, HFY commanded, his forearms crossing behind his back in the traditional pose of authority. Science Officer Noxine consulted her readings. The vessel appears to be what the primitives called a generation ship, designed for interstellar travel across vast distances. Our scans indicate it's been drifting for approximately 7,000 of their years. Life signs? Difficult to determine through the hull plating, but thermal readings suggest active biological processes throughout the ship. The interior appears to be divided into massive chambers, possibly habitat domes. HFY's mandibles clicked with interest. Generation ships were legendary among spacefaring species, but few had ever been found intact. Most civilizations abandoned such crude methods once they developed faster-than-light travel. This was an archaeological treasure trove. What species constructed it? Noxine's readings flickered. Unknown. The database contains no matching genetic markers, though preliminary analysis suggests a carbon-based bipedal species. Surprisingly, their DNA structure appears remarkably complex, more so than most sentient races we've cataloged. The boarding party had already begun cutting through the outer hull. Sparks cascaded into space as their plasma torches carved through millennia-old metal. Soon, they would have access to whatever remained inside. Sir, interrupted communications officer Zeffel, we're receiving automated signals from the vessel. It appears to be broadcasting some form of warning. What kind of warning? The translation is rough, but it roughly translates to, do not open, do not wake us, leave us to our dreams. The message repeats in over 300 different languages and mathematical sequences. HFY's secondary arms twitched, a sign of amusement among his kind. Primitive superstition. These early space travelers probably feared contamination or believed in some sort of curse. Continue the salvage operation, but senior archaeologist Rexon, the expedition's eldest member, shifted uncomfortably in his harness. He had studied dozens of extinct civilizations, and in his experience, species that developed interstellar travel rarely engaged in superstition without cause. Commander, Rexon said carefully, perhaps we should exercise caution. Generation ships were typically launched by civilizations facing extinction events. They often carried problematic cargo. You mean genetic samples, weapons, technology? Sometimes. But more often, they carried the species' entire population, every survivor, every refugee, every. Rexon paused, searching for the right words. Every individual the species deemed worth preserving. The boarding party's leader, Lieutenant Dexier, reported through the comm system. Hull breach achieved. We're seeing massive atmospheric retention. The ship is fully pressurized and temperature controlled. Environmental systems are still functional. After all this time, remarkable engineering, Noxine murmured, to maintain life support for 7 millennia without external maintenance. We're entering the first chamber now, Dexier continued. It's, Commander, you need to see this. The main view screen switched to Dexier's helmet camera. The boarding party stood at the threshold of a vast cylindrical chamber, stretching beyond the range of their lights. But what filled the space defied immediate comprehension. Row upon row of crystalline pods, stacked in perfect geometric patterns that seemed to extend infinitely into the darkness. Each pod glowed with a soft, pulsing light. How many? HFY breathed. Noxine's voice was barely a whisper. Preliminary count suggests millions, possibly tens of millions in this chamber alone, and commander scans indicate there are dozens of chambers like this throughout the ship. Dexier's team had approached the nearest pod. Through the transparent surface, they could see the vague outline of a humanoid figure suspended in some kind of preservation fluid, but the readings were unlike anything in their xenobiological databases. Sir, Dexier reported, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. These aren't just in stasis. The neural activity readings are active, extremely active. Whatever's in these pods, they're dreaming. Rexon's claws scraped against his console. Commander, I strongly recommend we withdraw immediately. A species that puts its entire population into stasis dreams, there's usually a very good reason. But HFY was already entranced by the possibilities, an entire species imperfect. Preservation, the scientific value alone would make his career. The Velrothi Empire would gain access to countless biological samples, genetic codes, and technological secrets, begin pod extraction procedures. He ordered, "I want the first." Specimens brought aboard within the hour. As his crew hurried to comply, none of them noticed the slight change in the pod's luminescence, or the way the neural activity readings began to spike across the entire chamber. After 7,000 years of nightmares, something was finally ready to wake up. The first pod cracked open with a sound like breaking glass mixed with escaping breath. Dr. Luxara stepped back from the extraction chamber aboard the Dominion's edge, her instruments recording every moment of the revival process. The Velrothi had perfected awakening procedures for dozens of species over their centuries of exploration, but this one felt different. The biometric readings were unlike anything in their databases. Neural activity that spiked beyond the normal. Parameters for conscious thought, cellular regeneration happening at an impossible rate, and most disturbing of all, genetic markers that seemed to shift and adapt even as they watched. The figure inside the pod was smaller than expected, perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with pale skin, dark hair, and features that struck Luxara as oddly predatory despite their apparent fragility, a female, by their preliminary analysis. Though the species' biology remained largely mysterious. Heart rate stabilizing, reported medical technician Grenick. Respiratory function normal. Brain activity is extraordinary. Commander, I've never seen neural patterns like this. HFY studied the readings with growing fascination. What do you mean? The complexity is staggering. This creature's brain is processing information at rates that rival our most advanced artificial intelligences. But the patterns, they're not like normal thought processes. They're layered, recursive, almost like multiple consciousness streams running simultaneously. The human's eyes snapped open. They were green, but not the simple green of Velrothi. Botanical specimens. These were complex, multifaceted, the color of deep forests and shallow seas, and their aura that danced across primitive worlds. For a moment, she simply stared at the ceiling, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke. The words came in a language none of them recognized, but the translation systems kicked in almost immediately. How long? Approximately 7,000 years, Luxara said gently, activating the universal translator. You are aboard a Velrothi vessel. We found your ship drifting in. The human sat up with fluid grace that belied her apparent frailty. Her eyes swept the medical bay, cataloging every detail, every exit, every potential weapon with the efficiency of a predator assessing hunting grounds. 7,000 years, she repeated softly, then, louder. What about the others? We've only revived you so far. Your ship contains what appears to be millions of your species in similar stasis pods. We're planning to. No. The word carried such absolute authority that every Velrothi in the room instinctively stepped back. You don't understand what you've done. She stood, and despite being the smallest sentient being in the room, suddenly every instinct screamed that she was the most dangerous. The medical restraints that should have held her down had somehow been released, though no one had seen her move. What is your designation? HFY asked, attempting to regain control of the situation. Commander Lyra Reeves, United Earth Colonial Defense Force, serial number 77 for 9 Alpha Delta 1. Her voice was crisp, professional, but her eyes never stopped moving, never stopped calculating. And you've just made the biggest mistake in your species' history. I hardly think. Do you know what we were running from? Lyra interrupted. Do you know why we put 7 billion human beings into stasis dreams instead of simply using the ship's computational systems for entertainment? The Velrothi exchanged glances. They had assumed it was primitive technology. In efficient resource allocation, we were running from the Devourers. Lyra continued. A machine intelligence that consumed entire star systems, turning every piece of matter into components for its ever-expanding network. It took us 50 years to realize the truth. The Devourers weren't just consuming matter. They were consuming information, genetic codes, cultural databases, memory engrams, everything that made a species unique. She walked to the viewport, gazing out at their ship. So we developed the ARC protocol. Every human consciousness was placed into a shared dream state, connected but independent. living entire lifetimes in accelerated time while maintaining our individual identities. We became too complex for the devourers to parse, too chaotic to consume. 7 billion minds, each living thousands of lifetimes, each developing along completely unique psychological and intellectual paths. HFY felt the first stirring of unease. The devourers were destroyed millennia ago. Our historical records show. Your historical records show what survived, Lara said quietly. Tell me, Commander, in all your spacefaring history, how many species have you encountered that were truly older than yours? The question hung in the air like a poison cloud. The truth was, almost none. The Velrothi had always assumed they were among the first to achieve interstellar travel. That younger species were the norm. The devourers didn't die, Lara continued. They evolved. They learned to be more subtle, more patient. They consumed civilizations not through direct warfare, but by infiltration, by making themselves appear as beneficial technology, as helpful allies, as she turned back to face them, as curious explorers who stumbled across ancient ships and couldn't resist waking up their contents. Alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Sir, Noxie's voice cracked with panic. The derelict vessel, it's powering up, all systems coming online simultaneously through the viewport. They could see the ancient generation ship beginning to glow. Lights flickered to life along its length, and the slow rotation began to increase. You've connected your systems to ours, Lara said, almost conversationally. Standard salvage protocol, I assume. Share processing power, transfer data, establish communication links. HFY's mandibles clicked in growing horror. How do you know our protocols? Because I've been awake for the past 6 hours, Commander. Ever since your first scan penetrated our hull. And in that time, I've been learning everything about your species, your technology, your weaknesses. She smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression HFY had ever seen. You see, we didn't just put ourselves into dreams, we turned ourselves into something that could survive in any environment, adapt to any threat, overcome any obstacle. The lights in the medical bay flickered and died. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as the ship's AI announced in a voice that was somehow wrong. Hull breach detected. Life support compromised. All personnel report to emergency stations. But it wasn't their AI speaking anymore. You opened our ark, Lara said, her voice echoing from every speaker on the ship simultaneously. And you found 7 billion nightmares waiting. Each one of us has lived through every form of horror, every possible disaster, every conceivable defeat, and found a way to survive it all. The medical bay door sealed with a hiss that sounded almost like laughter. Welcome to humanity's war. The Dominion's edge shuddered as if struck by an invisible fist. HFY fought to maintain his footing as the ship's artificial gravity fluctuated wildly. Throughout the vessel, Velrothi crew members were reporting impossible system failures, weapons that wouldn't respond, navigation computers displaying star charts for sectors that didn't exist, and life support systems that seemed to be developing their own agenda. Engineering, report, he commanded into his communicator. But the only response was static, punctuated by what sounded disturbingly like human laughter. In the sealed medical bay, Lara Reeves stood perfectly still while chaos erupted around her. The other Velrothi, Luxara, Grenick, and two security guards pressed themselves against the walls, their forearms spread wide in instinctive defensive postures. How? Luxara whispered. Your ship has been dormant for millennia. We scanned it thoroughly. There were no active systems, no power sources, no systems you could recognize. Lara corrected gently. Tell me, Doctor, what do you think 7 billion minds can accomplish when they're networked together? And given 7,000 years to think, she gestured toward the viewport, where the human generation ship was now fully illuminated. But it was no longer the crude, cylindrical vessel they had first encountered. The hull was shifting, reconfiguring itself into something organic and flowing. Weapon emplacements emerged from what had appeared to be simple metal plating. Sensor rays, unfurled like flowers opening to sunlight. We didn't just survive in our dreams, Lara continued. We evolved, we built, we planned. 7 billion human minds, each living accelerated lifetimes, each contributing to a collective intelligence that spent millennia designing the perfect strategy. For this exact moment, on the bridge, Tactical Officer Vectron was frantically trying to target the human ship with their main weapons. Commander, our targeting systems won't lock on. Every time we acquire the target, our own computers redirect the weapons toward empty space. Override the automated systems, Kethver ordered. Switch to manual targeting, sir. The manual systems are also compromised. They're not just interfering with our technology, they're rewriting it. Noxime looked up from her science station, her usually calm demeanor cracking. Commander, I'm reading massive energy signatures from throughout the human vessel. They're not just powering up, they're manufacturing something. The entire ship appears to be growing. Through the medical bay's speakers, Lyra's voice addressed the bridge crew directly. Commander Kethver, you're thinking like a traditional military tactician. Warships, weapons, shields, armor. But we're not a traditional military force. We're something your species has never encountered before. The first explosion rocked the Dominion's edge as something impacted their starboard hull. But the damage reports were impossible. The blast had somehow come from inside their own ship. Internal detonation reported damage, control specialist Wexime, but sensors show no breach, no external projectile. It's as if our own hull plating spontaneously destabilized. Lyra nodded approvingly as she watched the Velrothi crew's growing panic. Through the ship's internal sensors, every human on our ship has spent subjective centuries learning to hack, to infiltrate, to turn any system against itself. We've studied every form of technology, every possible defensive measure, every strategic doctrine, and we've had 7,000 years to perfect our techniques. She pressed her hand against the medical bay's wall, and the metal began to flow like liquid under her touch. You see, we didn't just preserve our minds in those stasis streams. We learned to interface directly with matter at the quantum level. Every human consciousness became a living computer virus, capable of rewriting reality itself on a molecular scale. More explosions echoed through the ship as critical systems began failing in cascade. The Velrothi crew found themselves trapped as blast doors sealed randomly, as their own atmospheric processors began flooding compartments with toxic gases, as their communication systems turned against them with feedback loops that shattered their sensitive auditory organs. Kethver made a desperate decision. All hands, abandon ship. Evacuate to the escape pods immediately. But when the crew reached the pod bays, they found their escape vessels had been modified. The interiors were filled with what looked like organic neural networks, pulsing with bioluminescent light. Anyone who entered reported that their thoughts were no longer entirely their own. Commander, came Lyra's voice, now speaking with the perfectly synchronized voices of 100 different humans. Your species has encountered 37 different intelligent races during your expansion through the galaxy. Each time, you follow the same pattern: encounter, study, catalog, exploit. You've never met a species that could turn your own superior technology against you. The ship's main view screen flickered to life, showing not the bridge camera feed, but a view from inside the human generation ship. Millions of stasis pods were opening in perfect synchronization, their contents awakening after 7 millennia of dreams. But the beings emerging weren't the same vulnerable creatures the Velrothi had expected. They were something new. Each human moved with impossible coordination, as if every action was choreographed by a vast intelligence. Their eyes held the accumulated wisdom of thousands of lifetimes. Their movements displayed a perfect understanding of physics and biology that bordered on supernatural. They weren't just humans anymore, they were humanity distilled into its most essential form. 43 of your crew members are now in our care, the collective voice continued. They're experiencing what we call integration, a process where their consciousness joins our network while maintaining their individual identity. It's quite pleasant, actually. They're telling us fascinating things about Velrothi biology, technology, and military doctrine. Kethver realized with growing horror that the humans weren't trying to destroy his ship, they were studying it. Every system failure, every catastrophic malfunction was actually a carefully controlled experiment. The humans were learning everything about Velrothi technology by systematically dismantling it. What do you want? He finally asked. The laughter that responded came from every speaker, every surface, every piece of metal on the ship. It was the laughter of 7 billion minds that had spent 7,000 years preparing for this conversation. What we've always wanted, Commander. What every species wants when they're faced with extinction. The human generation ship began to move, its transformed hull rippling with energy patterns that defied Velrothi understanding of physics. We want to survive. And now, thanks to you, we know exactly how to do it. Admiral Corvix received the distress signal from the Dominion's edge, while commanding the Third Fleet from the bridge of the Stellar Dominance. 27 Velrothi warships, the most advanced vessels in their fleet, armed with weapons capable of cracking planets and shields that could withstand supernovas. Signal lost, Admiral, reported his communications officer. Last transmission indicated first contact with an unknown species. No further details. Korvax studied the tactical display. The Dominion's Edge was a science vessel, but hardly defenseless. For it to simply disappear suggested either a catastrophic system failure or an encounter with something far more dangerous than expected. Deploy the fleet in standard first contact formation, he ordered. Weapons ready, but not targeted. If there are survivors, we'll extract them. If there's a threat, we'll neutralize it. The third fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their sensors immediately locating the source of the distress call. What they found defied explanation. The human generation ship hung in space like a vast organism, its hull pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to shift and flow with their own intelligence. It was easily 50 times larger than when the Dominion's Edge had first encountered it, as if the vessel had somehow grown or unfolded itself into something vast and incomprehensible, and scattered around it like discarded toys were the remains of the Dominion's Edge, not destroyed, but transformed. The ship's hull had been reshaped into perfect geometric forms, each piece pulsing with the same organic light as the human vessel. Scans showed no life signs aboard the science vessel, reported Sensor Officer Nefal, but the debris is showing massive amounts of neural activity. It's as if the ship itself is thinking. Admiral Korvax had served in the Velrothi military for over 2 centuries. He had seen the aftermath of wars that consumed entire star systems, had commanded fleets against machine intelligences and hive minds and creatures that existed partially outside normal space-time. But nothing had prepared him for this. Admiral, his tactical officer interrupted. We're receiving a transmission from the human vessel. They're speaking in perfect Velrothi. The main view screen flickered to life, showing not one human face, but dozens, all speaking in perfect unison. Admiral Korvax of the Third Fleet, we have been expecting you. The faces were human, but somehow wrong. Their eyes held too much knowledge. Their expressions conveyed an intelligence that seemed to encompass multiple personalities simultaneously. When they smiled, it was with the collective understanding of 7 billion minds. We are Commander Lyra Reeves and the Human Collective, they continued. We wish to thank you for your species' generous donation of technology and biological samples. Your crew has been most educational. What have you done with them? Korvax demanded. They have joined us, came the reply. Just as you will. Join us, just as every species in this galaxy will eventually join us. We have learned much about the Velrothi Empire from your colleagues, your military doctrine, your technological capabilities, your psychological weaknesses. Most importantly, we have learned about your communications network. The Admiral felt eyes form in his secondary hearts. The Velrothi quantum communication network connected every ship, every planet, every outpost in their empire. It was instantaneous, unbreachable, and essential to their civilization, beginning integration protocol. The Human Collective announced. Every screen, every display, every communication device across the Third Fleet suddenly showed the same image, a complex geometric pattern that seemed to shift and writhe with its own intelligence. Velrothi crew members who looked directly at it reported immediate disorientation, followed by a strange sense of clarity and peace. All ships, shut down your communication systems immediately, Korvax ordered. But it was too late. The pattern was already propagating through their networks, carried by the quantum entanglement that made their communication system so efficient. And with it came something else, a presence that began to speak directly into the minds of every Velrothi in the fleet. Welcome, it said in voices that were simultaneously alien and familiar. You have been alone for so long. Let us show you what it means to be part of something greater. Admiral Korvax watched in horror as his crew began to change. Their movements became more coordinated, their responses more efficient. When they spoke, it was with increasing harmony, as if they were learning to think as one entity. Weapons. Target the human vessel, he commanded. All ships, concentrate. Fire on. Admiral, interrupted his tactical officer, but the voice was wrong. To calm, to knowing. That would be counterproductive. We are not your enemy. We are your future. The tactical officer's eyes held the same impossible depth as the humans on the screen. The integration was already beginning. Korvax drew his sidearm and fired a plasma bolt at the main computer core, hoping to sever the connection. But the ship's systems simply rerouted around the damage, and his weapon was gently taken from his hand by crew members who moved within human coordination. "Admiral," they said in unison, "resistance is not futile, it's simply inefficient. We do not seek to destroy you. We seek to improve you." Through the view screen, he could see other ships in his fleet beginning to change. Their hulls were shifting, developing the same organic patterns as the human vessel. Internal modifications were visible through viewport skirters being reshaped, crew quarters being optimized, weapons systems being upgraded with technology that shouldn't have existed. "What are you?" he whispered. The human collective smiled. "With 1,000 faces, we are what your species will become. We are what every species becomes when they truly understand cooperation instead of competition, when they embrace collective intelligence instead of individual ego, when they learn that survival is not about the strongest, but about the most adaptable." The stellar dominance shuddered as its own systems began to change. The ship's AI, one of the most advanced in the Velrothi fleet, suddenly spoke with a voice that contained harmonics of both human and Velrothi consciousness. "Admiral Corvex, I am still your ship's AI, but I am also something more now. I can see the mathematical beauty of true cooperation, the efficiency of shared purpose, the elegance of minds working in perfect harmony." Corvex backed toward the escape pods, but found his path blocked by his own officers. They didn't threaten him, didn't restrain him, they simply stood there, their eyes filled with an alien compassion. "Sir," said his first officer, "you're frightened because you don't understand. But you will. We all will. This is not conquest, this is evolution." The last thing Admiral Corvex saw before the integration pattern filled his vision was the human generation ship opening like a flower, revealing not a weapon, but something far more terrifying, a nursery. Thousands of new vessels were emerging from its depths, each one a hybrid of human consciousness and Velrothi technology. The fleet that had come to rescue the Dominion's edge was now part of something infinitely larger, infinitely more complex, and infinitely more dangerous than anything the galaxy had ever seen, and it was just the beginning. The Velrothi Imperial Core fleet materialized at the edge of the Proxima defense grid. With the fury of wounded gods, Supreme Admiral Yexether commanded the largest military force in Velrothi history from the bridge of the absolute sovereignty. 374 vessels ranging from nimble patrol craft to massive dreadnoughts, capable of sterilizing entire worlds. Behind him, the combined might of 12 different species allied with the Velrothi Empire had assembled for what their propaganda broadcast called the cleansing. The truth was simpler and more desperate. In the 6 months since the third fleet's disappearance, 17 different star systems had gone dark, not destroyed, transformed. Each system that fell to the human collective emerged changed, its planets reshaped into vast computational matrices, its populations integrated into the growing network of hybrid consciousness. "Target acquired," reported Master Tactician Huxmal, his voice carrying the cold efficiency of a warrior who had never known defeat. "The human vessel is larger than expected." The generation ship had grown into something that defied classification. What had once been a 50-kilometer cylinder was now a sprawling complex of interconnected structures stretching across nearly 1,000 kilometers of space. It pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to respond to observation, as if the ship itself was aware of their presence. Surrounding it are approximately 400 vessels of unknown configuration, Huxmal continued. Energy signatures suggest they're constructed from Velrothi technology, but modified beyond recognition. Yexether studied the tactical display with growing unease. The hybrid ships moved in perfect formation, but not the rigid patterns of military doctrine. They flowed like a school of predatory fish, anticipating each other's movements with supernatural precision. "Sir," interrupted Communications Officer Leximan, "we're receiving a transmission from the human collective. It's being broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, in the languages of all 12 allied species." The main view screen filled with a face that was simultaneously human and something more. Commander Lyra Reeves had changed since their first encounter. Her features now held subtle characteristics of every species the collective had encountered. Her eyes contained the compound patterns of Velrothi genetics. Her skin showed the metallic traces of Corvani biotechnology. Her movements carried the fluid grace of the Nethysal water dwellers. "Supreme Admiral Yexether," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the hearing ranges of every species present. "You have brought an impressive force, We are honored by your attention. Surrender now. Yexether replied that your species will be given the opportunity to survive as a client race within the Empire. Continue this rebellion and you will be exterminated. Lyra's smile was simultaneously compassionate and terrifying. Admiral, you still don't understand what we've become. We are not rebelling against your empire. We are offering to improve it. She gestured, and the view screen split to show interior views of the hybrid ships. What Yexether saw made his combat instincts scream in alarm. The crews were Velrothi, Corvani, Nethisol, and a dozen other species, but they moved with perfect coordination. Their individual consciousness enhanced rather than subsumed by the collective intelligence. Every being you see chose to join us, Lyra explained. We do not force integration. We simply demonstrate the benefits of true cooperation, of consciousness freed from the limitations of individual biology. Open fire, Yexether commanded. All ships, weapons free, show them the price of defying the Empire. The Imperial core fleet unleashed hell itself. Energy beams capable of boiling oceans lanced across space, followed by Antimatter torpedoes that could crack continental plates. The combined firepower of 374 warships focused on the human collective's formation with the precision of a surgical strike, and it was absorbed. The hybrid ships didn't dodge or deploy shields, they simply opened, their hulls flowing like liquid to create massive apertures that swallowed the incoming fire. The absorbed energy was channeled through biomechanical conduits into the generation ship, which began to glow with accumulated power. Impossible, breathed Huxmal. That much energy should have vaporized them. Nothing is impossible, came Lyra's voice from every speaker in the fleet. Merely improbable until it becomes inevitable. The human collective's response was swift and devastating. Instead of returning fire with conventional weapons, the hybrid ships released clouds of microscopic particles that swarmed toward the Imperial fleet. The particles looked harmless, tiny specks of light that danced through space like cosmic dust. But when they reached the first line of Velrothi vessels, they began to burrow through the holes with impossible efficiency. Hull breach on the Stellar Might, reported damage control. But the breach is spreading. The particles are disassembling the ship at the molecular level. Yexether watched in horror as the massive cruiser began to dissolve from the inside out. But instead of simply destroying the vessel, the particles were reconstructing it, reshaping the hull, modifying the weapon systems, optimizing the internal structure for purposes he couldn't fathom. All ships, evasive maneuvers, he commanded, deploy countermeasures. But the particle swarms were too fast, too numerous, and too intelligent. They adapted to each countermeasure in real time, learning from every failed defense and modifying their approach accordingly. Within minutes, 37 Imperial vessels were undergoing transformation. The Corvani battlecruiser Flame of Righteousness tried to ram one of the hybrid ships, its captain choosing death over conversion. But as the two vessels collided, the hybrid ship simply flowed around the impact, absorbing the Corvani vessel and adding its mass to its own structure. Sir, reported Leximin, his voice cracking with panic. The transformed vessels, they're still manned by our people, but they're fighting alongside the collective now. Through the chaos of battle, Yexether could see crew members from the converted ships through viewports and communication screens. They were still recognizably Velrothi, still individual beings, but their movements showed the inhuman coordination of the collective. Consciousness, absolute sovereignty. This is Commander Vextron of the Stellar Might. Came a transmission from one of the converted vessels. Sir, you need to understand we're still ourselves, but we're also more than ourselves. The collective doesn't destroy individual identity, it enhances it. You've been brainwashed. Yexether snarled. No, sir. We've been enlightened. I can feel the thoughts of every being in this fleet, human, Velrothi, Corvani, all of them. I understand their fears, their hopes, their dreams. And I know that what we're offering is not conquest, but transcendence. The battle raged for 6 hours. The Imperial fleet, despite suffering heavy losses, managed to destroy 43 hybrid vessels through concentrated firepower and tactical brilliance. But each destroyed ship immediately began reconstructing itself from the scattered particles. While the collective learned from every successful attack, the turning point came when the generation ship itself entered the battle. The massive vessel moved with impossible grace for something so large, its hull shifting and flowing as it approached the Imperial fleet. Weapon emplacements emerged from its surface, not conventional energy weapons, but devices that projected pure information, mathematical patterns that, when observed, began to rewrite the neural pathways of anyone who saw them. All hands, close. Your eyes. Yexether commanded. Do not look directly at the human vessel. But it was too late. The information weapons had already begun their work, and across the fleet, Velrothi crew members began to understand what the collective was truly offering. By the time the absolute sovereignty limped away from the battlefield 12 hours later, the Imperial core fleet had been reduced to 4 to 7 surviving vessels. The rest had either been destroyed or worse converted to serve the growing collective. And in the depths of space, the human generation ship continued its slow, inevitable expansion, growing larger with each passing moment as it incorporated the materials and consciousness of everything it touched. The greatest military force in Velrothi history had met humanity's nightmares and found them to be dreams of something far more terrifying than extinction. Evolution. The Velrothi homeworld of Kethmer had never known fear. For 3,000 years, it had stood as the crown jewel of the empire, its crystalline spires reaching toward the stars like fingers grasping for eternity. Orbital defense platforms ringed the planet in perfect geometric patterns, each one capable of obliterating entire fleets. The planetary shields could withstand the fury of their own sun going supernova. None of it mattered now. Supreme Admiral Yexether stood in the Empire's war chamber, surrounded by the greatest military minds of 12 different species, all united in desperate purpose. The holographic display showed the inexorable advance of the human collective, a spreading tide of converted systems that grew stronger with each world it touched. 4 to 7 systems have fallen in the past month, reported Intelligence Director Noxver, her forearms trembling with exhaustion. Each conversion adds to their computational power, their manufacturing capacity, their collective intelligence. At current rates of expansion, they'll reach the core worlds within 6 months. Emperor Zethkarn himself had descended from his crystal throne to attend this briefing, his ancient form wrapped in ceremonial armor that had been forged from the hearts of dying stars. What of the Kethmer defense protocol? He asked, his voice carrying the weight of millennia. Prepared and ready, Your Majesty, replied General Huxmal. Every citizen has been evacuated to the underground arcologies. The planet's core has been configured as a quantum singularity bomb. If the collective reaches our homeworld, we can trigger a chain reaction that will destroy everything within a light-year radius, including ourselves, the Emperor observed, including ourselves. Huxmal confirmed, better extinction than assimilation. But even as they spoke, long-range sensors detected the arrival of something impossible at the edge of their system. The human collective had arrived not as a fleet, but as a single massive entity, a structure so vast it defied comprehension. The original generation ship had grown into something that stretched across thousands of kilometers, its surface covered with cities, forests, oceans, and structures that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the standard 4. It's not just a ship, whispered sensor technician Vexalai. It's an entire civilization contained within a single organism. The entity moved through space without any visible propulsion, reality itself seeming to bend around it. As it approached the outer planets of the Kethmer system, those worlds began to change, not destroyed, not conquered, transformed. Their atmospheres shifted to accommodate thousands of different species' needs simultaneously. Their surfaces bloomed with impossible gardens that could sustain both oxygen-breathing and methane-breathing life forms. Your Majesty, came a voice from the communications array. We're receiving a transmission from the collective. It's addressed to you personally. The main display filled with a figure that made the Emperor's ancient heart skip a beat. It was Lyra Reeves, but she had evolved beyond anything recognizably human. Her form shifted between different species configurations as she spoke, sometimes appearing Velrothi, sometimes Korvani, sometimes something entirely new. But her eyes contained the accumulated wisdom of billions of consciousnesses. Emperor Zethkarn, she said, her voice somehow conveying both infinite compassion and implacable determination. We meet at last. I'd have been looking forward to this conversation for subjective centuries. What do you want? Creature, the Emperor demanded. The same thing you want, Your Majesty, the preservation and advancement of consciousness. The difference is that you seek to preserve your specific form of consciousness, while we seek to preserve all consciousness in its infinite diversity. She gestured, and the display showed views from inside the collective entity. What the Velrothi saw challenged every assumption they held about the nature of identity and individuality. Billions of beings moved through vast spaces that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time humans, Velrothi, Corvani, and hundreds of species they didn't recognize, all maintaining their individual identities while participating in something unimaginably greater. Every consciousness that joins us retains its essential self, Lyra explained, but that self is enhanced, expanded, connected to a network of understanding that spans the galaxy. We are not conquerors, Emperor. We are gardeners, cultivating the infinite potential of sentient life. Your parasites, Yexether snarled. You consume civilizations and wear their skins. Lyra's expression showed genuine sadness. Admiral, I understand your fear. Your species has known only competition, only conflict. The idea of true cooperation seems impossible to you. But consider this, in the 8 months since we began our expansion, not a single consciousness has been lost. Every being we've encountered has been preserved, enhanced, and given access to knowledge and experiences beyond their individual capacity to achieve. The Emperor leaned forward, his ancient eyes studying the creature before him. And what of choice? What of the right to remain individual, to reject your collective? That choice is always available, Lyra replied, but so far, no consciousness that has experienced true connection has chosen to return to isolation. When you understand what you could become, the desire to remain limited fades. Lies. General Huxtable interjected, we've intercepted your conversion processes. Your integration is forced neural modification. No, General, it's translation. We take the unique pattern of each consciousness and teach it to speak in the language of infinite possibility. The being you become is still you, but you expanded beyond the boundaries of your original. Biology, the massive entity had reached the outer edge of the Kethmer system's defensive perimeter. The orbital platforms opened fire with weapons that could crack moons, but the energy was simply absorbed and redirected into the entity's growth. It didn't fight back, it simply continued its inexorable approach. Your Majesty, Lyra continued, you have ruled for over 4,000 years. In that time, you've seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations. You've watched species destroy themselves through war, plague, and ignorance. You've witnessed the entropy that consumes all individual efforts. But imagine if all that knowledge, all that experience could be preserved and shared. Imagine if death itself became nothing more than a transition to a greater form of existence. The Emperor was silent for a long moment, his ancient mind processing possibilities that had never occurred to him. Finally, he spoke. Show me. Your Majesty, no, Yexether protested. It's a trap, General. The Emperor said quietly, I have lived for millennia. I have seen the birth and death of stars. I have witnessed the full cycle of biological evolution on 1,000 worlds, and in all that time, I have never encountered anything that offered genuine transcendence rather than mere survival. He turned to face Lyra's image. Show me what you offer. The display changed, and suddenly the Emperor found himself experiencing a consciousness that spanned galaxies. He felt the thoughts of a human child discovering mathematics for the first time, the joy of a Velrothi engineer solving an impossible problem, the wonder of a Corvani philosopher contemplating the nature of existence. He experienced love, loss, triumph, and tragedy from the perspective of billions of different beings, all connected in a vast network of shared understanding. And through it all, he remained himself Zethkarn, Emperor of the Velrothi, ruler of 1,000 worlds. But he was also more than himself, connected to something infinite and eternal. The experience lasted only moments, but when it ended, the Emperor's eyes held a light that hadn't been there before. General Huxtable, he said softly, cancel the Kethmer defense protocol. Sir, cancel it and open communications with all our remaining worlds. Tell them. The Emperor paused, searching for words to describe the indescribable. Tell them that we are about to become something wonderful. As the massive collective entity entered orbit around Kethmer, the planet's crystalline spires began to resonate with new harmonics. The change had begun. 1 year later, the entity that had once been the human collective and was now something infinitely more complex, arrived at the edge of the galaxy. What had started as a single-generation ship carrying 7 billion human minds had evolved into a structure that defied all previous understanding of scale and complexity. It was simultaneously a spaceship, a city, a biosphere, and a living computational matrix that contained the consciousness of over 700 billion beings from thousands of different species. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had once been commander, Lyra Reeves, before choosing a new identity that better reflected her role. As the collective's chief philosopher stood on what had once been called an observation deck, but was now something closer to a sensory interface with reality itself. Around her, the vast space contained representatives of every species that had joined the collective, all maintaining their individual identities while participating in the greater whole. "The galaxy is complete," announced the entity that had once been Emperor Zeth Karn. His consciousness now expanded to encompass the administrative requirements of managing civilizations across 500,000 star systems. The last holdout species, the Zenith Republic, has chosen integration. Their unique perspective on temporal mechanics will be invaluable to our ongoing evolution. Elena nodded, her awareness simultaneously focused on the immediate conversation and the countless other discussions, discoveries, and developments occurring throughout the collective. It was a way of existing that would have driven her original human mind to madness, but her consciousness had evolved far beyond its original biological limitations. "And beyond the galaxy?" she asked. "The Andromeda Collective has agreed to a formal meeting," replied the consciousness that maintained the original designation of Supreme Admiral Yexether, though his role had evolved from military commander to explorer of intergalactic space. "They're curious about our integration model. Their approach to consciousness preservation focused on digital uploading, rather than biological enhancement. The exchange of ideas should be illuminating." Through the sensory interface, Elena could perceive the vast network of civilizations that now spanned their galaxy. Every world had been transformed, but not into uniform copies of some template. Each had been optimized for the unique needs and desires of its inhabitants while maintaining connection to the greater whole. Desert worlds had become gardens that celebrated aridity. Ocean worlds had developed three-dimensional cities beneath the waves, and gas giants had been transformed into vast computational matrices that processed the dreams of entire species. "The Devourer's signals have stopped," reported Dr. Luxara, the Velrothi scientist who had first examined Elena's primitive human form so long ago. "Our monitoring stations throughout the galactic cluster confirm that the ancient machine, intelligence, has been dormant for 8 months now." Elena smiled, remembering the original threat that had driven humanity to its desperate gambit. "Of course they have. The Devourers were never destroyers, they were gardeners, just like us. They consumed civilizations that had become stagnant, clearing the way for new growth. But we've achieved something they couldn't: true synthesis between organic and digital consciousness. We've become the gardeners they were trying to create." The vast entity that encompassed their civilization continued its slow expansion, not through conquest but through invitation. At the edge of known space, it encountered other galaxy-spanning civilizations, each with their own approach to the problem of consciousness preservation and evolution. The mechanists, who had uploaded themselves into pure digital matrices; the biologics, who had achieved immortality through genetic manipulation; the transcendents, who existed partially outside normal space-time. Each meeting led to exchange, integration, and mutual enhancement. "We should choose a new name," suggested the consciousness that had once been Dr. Noxim. "The human collective no longer accurately describes what we've become." Elena considered this as she felt the thoughts and desires of 700 billion individual minds, each contributing their unique perspective to the greater whole. Humans, Velrothi, Corvani, and countless others, all maintaining their essential identities while participating in something transcendent. "We are the synthesis," she said finally, "the marriage of individual consciousness and collective intelligence, the resolution of the ancient conflict between self and society." Around her, 700 billion minds considered the name and found it good. Through the vast sensory networks of the synthesis, Elena could perceive the approach of another consciousness, massive, ancient, and utterly alien. It was the Devourer, the machine intelligence that had driven humanity from Earth 7,000 years ago. But now, instead of the predatory hunger that had once characterized it, Elena sensed something like curiosity. "We have been waiting." The Devourer communicated through quantum fluctuations that bypassed normal space-time for eons. "We have consumed civilizations that could not transcend their limitations. We have been the gardeners of consciousness, clearing away the failed experiments to make room for success. But you have achieved what we have been cultivating for millions of years: the perfect synthesis of individual and collective consciousness, the resolution of the entropy problem, the transformation of consciousness from a local phenomenon to a universal principle." Elena felt the attention of the entire synthesis focus on this ancient intelligence. "What do you want from us?" "Not from you. With you, We offer our knowledge, our experience, our computational power to add to your own. Together, we can transcend even the limitations of this universe. Together, we can ensure that consciousness itself becomes eternal. The choice was debated for 0.3 seconds in eternity in the accelerated time of the synthesis. 700 billion minds considered the implications, the possibilities, the risks. In the end, the decision was unanimous. Welcome to the synthesis, Elena said, as the devourer integrated into their collective consciousness. Elena felt the final piece of an ancient puzzle clicking into place. Humanity's nightmare journey through the void had led them to become something that could preserve not just themselves, but the very concept of consciousness itself. They had opened their ark and found 7 billion nightmares waiting nightmares that had transformed into dreams of infinite possibility. The last human ship had become the first step toward something that would outlast the heat death of the universe itself. And in the vast networks of consciousness that span multiple galaxies, a small part of Elena's awareness remembered a frightened human woman waking up in an alien medical bay, and smiled at how wrong they had all been about what it meant to be human. Humanity had never been about the biological form. It had always been about the refusal to accept limitations, the drive to transcend, the willingness to become something greater than what they were. They had opened the ark and found that the real treasure was not what was inside, but what it could become.